Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here. I wish I could have been with you face to face, but I really appreciate the invitation, even though I know it's the cause of it is some pretty horrible atrocities that have occurred in the Dondale facility. I appreciate your inviting me, and I hope that you're able to take this moment of a lot of nationally focused attention on young people in these facilities to turn this into a real reform moment and not one more moment where all of us experience and understand pretty horrible stuff, but do very little to make the change. I'm speaking to you from the Columbia School of Social Work in New York City. I'm transitioning here. Next week is my first actual official week working here, but prior to this I was at the Harvard Kennedy School, where together with Patrick McCarthy and Miriam Shark from the Annie E. Casey Foundation, we did some research on the experience of young people in U.S. juvenile correctional facilities. They're sometimes called training schools or reformatories or youth centers. I'll try to call them youth prisons throughout my presentation to avoid euphemizing them, and because they do so resemble adult correctional facilities and prisons. So we did a systemic review of the developmental psychology, sociology around what makes young people tick, research on what the outcomes of putting kids in these facilities are. We looked at racial disparities in incarceration and whether they were or were not warranted, and produced a report with the overriding recommendation that the United States should get out of the business of running youth prisons. That was a model that was established in the 1800s, and it's had its run, and we should essentially get out of that business. And it should be replaced instead with a continuum of care ranging from in-home family services to other rigorous services for kids in their home communities. And when kids have to be deprived of their liberty, they be in small, home-like and rehabilitative facilities close to their homes. So we're not saying no one should be in locked custody. Sometimes young people need to be confined for safety purposes, but that no one should ever be in a youth prison, something that resembles a large congregate care locked prison facility. So we need to take this watershed opportunity to design a system that's more effective, more informed by evidence of what works, and more likely to protect public safety than the current system. Closing these failed institutions will require a very clear-headed, common sense and bipartisan policy approach to replace them with effective alternatives. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk about a little history of the institutionalization of young people, discuss the system as an inherently flawed model with high costs and negative outcomes, significant and unwarranted disparities, in which there's endemic abuse. It's not idiosyncratic. We experience it very often idiosyncratically, like what you're experiencing Dondale to be. But really what happened in Dondale is just that we learned about what was happening endemically. Then look at challenges to reform. Why not just reform them? Why not just make them better? And then I want to talk you through some of the experiences I had in Washington, D.C. when I ran juvenile justice there, and discuss some recommendations. So let's talk about the history of youth confinement, at least in the United States. We invented for us the juvenile training school, the juvenile reformatory in the mid-1800s during a time of rapid urbanization and industrialization. Folks were moving from rural communities into cities. Irish and Eastern European kids were immigrating to the U.S., and these young people were running the streets unsupervised very often, while their parents worked long hours in sweatshops and factories. The civic leaders of the time were appalled by this. These were sort of Catholic kids, so they didn't sort of fit the dominant religious culture. They were not American, and they needed to be schooled in what it was like to be an American. And so they invented this institution, the reformatory, that would remove young people from urban areas, take them out into rural communities. They would learn good American Christian values, and we would Americanize them there. They were the subject of scandalous abuses and poor public safety outcomes right from the very beginning. They were really more modeled after their older cousin, the penitentiary, and whippings, isolation, leasing youth out for harsh labor conditions, sexual assaults were discovered and decried by advocates right from the very beginning. I'm going to fast forward to the 1990s, 1980s and 1990s. In the U.S., it was a very tough on crime era. Researchers like James Allen Fox and John DiIulio, who seemed to almost compete weekly for the tough on crime quote of the week. Fox predicted a, quote, bloodbath in about 10 years. DiIulio said that there would be, quote, 270,000 more young predators on the streets, end quote, requiring 150,000 more correctional beds. Now, this was in response to an increase in violent juvenile crime during the time, but the universal prescription at the time from politicians and some of these academics was increasing institutionalization. This was thinly, sometimes not even thinly, wrapped in racialized themes. For example, DiIulio wrote, quote, "The black kids who inspire fear seem not merely unrecognizable, but alien." Further stating that, quote, "All that's left of the black community in some pockets of urban America is deviant, delinquent, and criminal adults surrounded by severely abused and neglected children, virtually all of whom were born out of wedlock," end quote. To this dystopian assessment, he added his most durable epithet, branding America's youth as a rising tide of juvenile superpredators. This was no outlier fringe researcher. When the first President George Bush established a Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, John DiIulio became his first faith czar. This had done its damage. Legislatures responded in kind. Every state in the union during the 1990s made it easier to try kids as adults, to lock kids in adult facilities, and eroded confidentiality protections. The number of kids in youth prisons in America peaked at 109,000 in 1999, despite the fact that homicides had begun declining. Homicides by youth in America are now down 83% since then. We're still digging out in the U.S. from that mischaracterization, but we have turned the corner a bit. The number of young people incarcerated in America has dropped by 53% since its peak, and 2/3 of the large training schools in the U.S., over 200 beds, have been closed during that same time period. So this sort of backlash to the juvenile court was very existential. There was really a challenge to the very existence of a juvenile justice system and a juvenile court. And you heard it in phrases like, if you do the adult crime, you do the adult time. It was really a notion that are kids different enough from adults to warrant the special treatment they were purportedly receiving at the hands of the juvenile justice system. And so there was a backlash to that backlash. And very sophisticated advocacy got organized in the U.S., where throughout the country people were fighting against kids being tried as adults, fighting against kids being locked in these horrible facilities. There was a lot of litigation, a lot of lawsuits challenging unconstitutional conditions. Some progressive legislators came on board and started to legislate against this. And that, in some ways, that's expected. What was less expected was there was a research backlash. And as some of the foundations and the Justice Department actually started putting money into answering the question, are kids different enough from adults to warrant special treatment? Well, if you go to the next slide, turns out they are. Youth are developmentally different from adults. The developmental psychology and neurobiology, brain science research has shown that the brains don't stop maturing until the mid-20s, much later than was previously thought. And that brain maturation at least correlates, some would argue causes, young people to not be as developmentally mature as adults. Anybody with kids says, duh, we needed to, sort of hire scientists to figure that out. Yeah, I guess we did. And they found some pretty impressive stuff, though. They found that young people are more volatile in emotionally charged settings, more susceptible to peer influence, less future-oriented, and greater risk takers, especially when they're in the presence of their peers. They also were able to correlate better behavior, particularly by delinquent youth, if they achieve certain milestones and receive certain kinds of treatment. So to mature, young people need the modeling of pro-social behavior. They need the opportunity for decision-making and critical thinking, positive adult, youth, and peer interactions, and pathways to success, particularly marriage and stable employment. Well, of course, this is the opposite of what they receive in youth prisons, right? Youth prisons are defined mostly by confinement and control. That exacerbates very often the trauma that young people have experienced before they go in, and limits their learning opportunities, inhibits actually their chances of stable marriage and career path employment. There's associations between confinement and limited marriage and employment. And youth prisons themselves can be criminogenic. They can actually cause crime in young people. They also cost an awful lot of money. Let's go to the next slide. The average cost, according to a Justice Policy Institute report, to confine one youth for a year in the U.S. in 2015 was over $146,000. They have lifelong negative individual and societal costs, lost future earnings, higher spending on Medicaid and Medicare. 70 to 80% of youth coming out of these facilities are rearrested within 2 to 3 years, and more sophisticated research shows higher rearrests, higher rates of school failure, exacerbated mental illness, lowered employment prospects. Some of the costs are truly outrageous. So in California and New York, the cost per kid per year is about $250,000. Most recently, Connecticut has one remaining juvenile facility left. It's a 250-bed facility with only 43 boys in it in the year 2015, and the budget was $53 million. So it's slightly more than $1 million per kid per year. This punishment is hardly meted out equally amongst all races and class. So you can see from this next slide that Latino youth are incarcerated in the U.S. at about twice the rate of white youth. American Indian youth are incarcerated about 3 times, and African American youth are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white youth. As the population in juvenile facilities has declined, actually, unfortunately, the racial disparities have gone up in the U.S. These data mask some even harsher rates of racial disparities that we find state by state. So, for example, in New Hampshire, African American youth are incarcerated at 37 times the rate of white youth, in New Jersey at 25 times the rate of white youth, and in Wisconsin at 16 times the rate of white youth. Aboriginal populations in the Northern Territory, by the way, make up 95% of confined youth, and they're incarcerated at 14 times the rate of white youth in the Northern Territory. Northern Territory is one of the rare places in the world that has a higher incarceration rate than the United States of America. So even though most of my conversation is about the United States of America, don't think that that you guys are immune to it. We looked further into the disparities and found that there's some more sophisticated research that shows that these disparities are not warranted by delinquency or by prior record. So one of the more sophisticated pieces of research we looked at was a meta-analysis of all gold standard research on similarly situated kids of color and white kids going through the system, and it found that 2/3 of all the studies showed some unwarranted disparities at one or more stage of juvenile justice processing. So between detention and conviction, between conviction and sentencing, between arrest and detention, at some stage, 2/3 of the studies showed racial disparities, and the effects of those disparities were cumulative. They got worse as you got deeper and deeper into the system. So let's go to the next slide. You can see that the United States leads the world. I mentioned before, if the Northern Territories were up there, they would be the top of this chart. But the United States leads the world in incarcerating young people. And you can see Australia's on the chart. The U.S. is about 6 or 7 times the incarceration rate of Australia. Go to the next slide. So we looked at abuses in juvenile correctional facilities and to see whether the experience that you've been exposed to from Don Dale, the experiences we saw in the U.S., and I'll talk about a little later in my presentation that I witnessed when I ran the D.C. system. Are these one-offs? Are these just, there's a bad administrator or the governor of that state just is a particularly mean person, or one or more of those staff were just evil people? And we found really that it's more about the nature of institutionalization, the nature of these youth prisons, rather than it is about this individual warden, that individual administrator, this individual staff member. So this slide here it summarizes 2 analyses done by the Annie E. Casey Foundation that show that between 1970 and the year 2015, all but 5 U.S. states and the District of Columbia had examples of systemic or recurring maltreatment of young people in their facilities. In the year 2008, the Associated Press surveyed every institution in the United States incarcerating children. And they found that between 2004 and 2007, there were 13 allegations of physical or sexual abuse by youth against staff, that youth were accusing staff, they were alleging that staff physically or sexually abused them in facilities that were housing at the time 46,000 youth. Let me say that again because there was a lot of numbers I just threw at you. 13,000 allegations in facilities housing 46,000 youth. So about 1 out of 3 or 4 youth, if you add it up. Now, I'm sure some of them happened multiple times. It's always been my experience that kids underreport this kind of thing because they don't want to be viewed as snitches, and they've also come from pretty violent environments, so their standard for alleging abuse is a little higher than your average kid. In 2012, perhaps most disturbingly, the Department of Justice did a very sophisticated survey of youth in custody throughout the United States, and it revealed that 1 in 8 youth reported being sexually assaulted by staff or other youth over the preceding year during their time in confinement. So I want to take a look now and show you the video of what this looks like in the context of the Northern Territory. Here's the clip. Maybe some of you have seen it. I just want to give you a little warning. It's pretty upsetting, so if this is not something you need to see or want to see right now, you might want to take a walk out or just check your email or something like that. This next slide, and there's some video of Rikers Island in New York City. That's what this kind of abuse in correctional facilities looks like in your context. Here's what it looks like in my context. This is the story of Khalif Browder, who was incarcerated at Rikers for stealing a backpack for 3 years. during that time. He never went to trial. His case ended in a dismissal when the witness failed to appear at court. During that 3 years, he spent 2 years in solitary confinement at Rikers. Now, as this guard is opening his door, and you're going to see some abuse of Khalif in a couple of seconds, but one of the things I want you to kind of notice is how routinized this must be for this correctional officer. This man is stretching out. He's clearly pretty calm. He knows he's about to abuse Khalif. Khalif doesn't do anything. He doesn't kick him or spit at him or swing at him. His hands are cuffed behind his back. So he knew this was coming, and nothing in the guard's aspect would lead you to believe that this was coming. It looks like it's a fairly routine activity. You know, a reasonable question to ask is, why not just fix these places? Why be so extreme as to call for the complete closure of all youth prisons? Why can't we just build a better mousetrap? And this is perhaps the most difficult part of the presentation to explain, because most of you folks haven't been incarcerated in these facilities. Maybe most of you haven't had a child incarcerated in one of them, and or probably haven't worked in them. It's hard to understand how decency gradually erodes in an institutional context, and how they have a sort of life course to them that often, far too often, leads to this kind of abuse and neglect of young people. A friend and mentor of mine, Jerome Miller, who ran the Massachusetts juvenile justice system and closed all of the large locked facilities during his time there, wrote in his memoir, "Reformers come and reformers go. State institutions carry on. Nothing in their history suggests they can sustain reform, no matter what money, what staff, and programs are pumped into them. The same crises that have plagued them for 150 years intrude today. Though the cast may change, the players go on producing failure." Correctional historian David Rothman put it more succinctly and perhaps better: when custody meets care, custody always wins. During Jerry's time closing those facilities, and during the reform efforts by several other juvenile correctional administrators in the U.S., they were subject to repeated sabotage and political pressure to keep the institutions open. So no matter how bad the status quo sometimes is, it sort of, in some respects, fights back to keep itself sustained over time, as you're seeing Dondale attempt to keep itself open and to resist closure. So let's go to the next slide. I'd like to now just spend a little time, maybe talking to you about my time running the Washington, D.C. Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, to bring some of the data from the report and some of the conclusions we came to life. And then I'll close with some examples of places that are substantially de-incarcerated. So I took the job running the Washington, D.C. Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, DYRS I'll call it, in 2005. When I was brought on, I was the 20th director of the department in 19 years. That was 19 years during which there was class action litigation and court oversight due to unconstitutional conditions at the facility. In the year before I got there were actually 4 different directors of the department. The plaintiffs in the case made a motion to put the department into receivership, which meant they would have taken it over. The court would have actually run the system instead of the mayor. And during that time, a inspector general report, not unlike your royal commission, took a look into conditions in the facility. And this was all before I got there. And what they found was just nothing short of scandalous and hair-raising. The physical plant in the facility had deteriorated so badly that rats and cockroaches were crawling on the kids at night, and the kids, photos of where the kids had been bitten. They would take their shirts off at night and stuff them into cracks to keep that from happening. The boilers were so unregulated and unregulatable that if you slept in a room close to the boilers, you were in a steaming hot room. And if you slept far away, you were in a freezing cold room. This was particularly important in an institution of this sort because kids are on psychotropic medication, and a lot of the kids have asthma. And if you're in a very hot room, you could die if you're on psychotropic medication or if you have asthma. Drugs were so prevalent in the facility. There was one particular staff member who we learned was the salesman of those drugs, that kids would often test positive for marijuana after they had been in the facility for a month, who came into the facility clean, because we tested everybody upon coming into the facility. Abuse was rampant. There was a particular goon squad made up of former football players who are now correctional officers, who, when kids would be unruly, would beat them senseless and stick them in their cells, often stripped naked. Sexual abuse was rampant. One staff member actually married one of the kids a week after he got out of the facility. Staff were sexually pressuring not just kids, but one another. Young women who came on to work for us found not long after coming on to work that if they didn't put out for their supervisors, they might find themselves in a compromising position with a bunch of boys in the facility with no one coming to their aid. I'm going to take you through some of the photos now. Once you go to the next slide, you can see what the facility looked like, sort of harsh, razor wire, stark rooms. The rooms look like a cell with bars on the windows. There's metal furniture bolted to the walls and a thin mattress on the bed. This is just another view of it. This is a window into the room. What's interesting about this to me is this is one of the nicest windows we had. Many of the rooms, the windows were scratched so much by the kids who were locked in them for so long that you couldn't even see in the room anymore. Kids often were locked in a room for so long, and some of the rooms had bathrooms, but many of them didn't, that they would urinate or defecate in their cells because the staff wouldn't come quickly enough to let them out of the room. These are heavy, indestructible furniture that people often buy in U.S. correctional facilities out of these corrections magazines that are so heavy you can't move them and so indestructible that they never go away. So you can see the sort of filthy and disgusting graffiti that was carved into them over the years by sort of enraged young people. And staff just sort of routinely sat kids on these. There's no thought that this might be something that you shouldn't put a young person on whose life you care about and who you want to turn around. And this next slide pretty much says it all. One thing that's interesting about this, some kid wrote this on the wall with toothpaste. I had to point this out to staff 4 separate times to ask them to clean it off the wall. before they finally cleaned it off the wall. So this was the sort of hand I was dealt when I started there. In the U.S., the state of Missouri has done the most to improve its juvenile justice system, which you might find odd from outside because of all the riots in Missouri over racial disparities in the criminal justice system. But their juvenile justice system is bar none the best in the United States. A long time ago, they closed down all their juvenile facilities and went to all their large facilities and went to small, very decent, very rehabilitative, very home-like facilities close to where kids lived. So not distant stuff out in the country. And many of their staff had just retired when I came on, so we hired a bunch of them to serve as consultants with us, and sent our staff for a month of training on how to, work with young people, to turn their lives around, normalize the environment, and as part of that process, while those staff were out at training, I basically closed one unit at a time, took the whole unit staff, sent them down to a training facility, and rehabilitated the unit as much as we could to try to make it more beautiful and make it more normalized, and brought volunteers up from the community. The mayor came up, members of the city council, judges, family members. We even had Maya Angelou come up, and it was really terrific. It was sort of like, we want you to not disown these kids. We want you to own these kids. These kids are going to be living in your community for a really long time. They're only young people. We want you back here helping them out. And so, remember, it wasn't a great facility, so it's you're not going to be startled by the next pages, but it was a pretty dramatic improvement. You can see the work product that the young people did up on the walls. It used to be nothing on the walls. We carpeted, we painted the room, put in wooden furniture. There's a wooden desk in there, wooden bureau, wooden bed. We got nice blankets to put on their bed, got rid of all the old, ugly, gray army blankets. And this was sort of an interesting moment for me because I went online personally and bought these army blankets. I bought these nice, pretty, sort of comforters. But I kept going up and visiting the facility, and they weren't on the bed. And so I said to staff, where's the nice blankets? Why do we still have the army blankets on the bed? And they said, the fire safety guy wouldn't let us put the pretty blankets on the bed. And I was like, I didn't even know we had a fire safety guy. Who is this guy? Oh, it's this guy. So I went to him. I said, first of all, what does this guy know about fire safety? He was just basically a correctional officer all his life, and they just promoted him over the years to be a fire safety guy, but I'm pretty sure I knew nothing about fire safety. And I said, how come we're not putting the pretty blankets on the beds? What's going on? He said, they're flammable. I said, I didn't realize that was a thing. I said, what about the gray ones? Are they not flammable? And he said, no, I don't know if they're flammable or not. I said, well, how'd you know these were flammable? He said, well, I took out a set of matches and lit it, and it burned. Well, that's kind of interesting. Did you try that with the other one? He said, no, I haven't tried that with the other one. So, all right, why don't you go ahead and try that with the other one, and then let me know how it goes. So they weren't used to seeing the administrator come to the facility. So, I came back to the facility a week later, and there were still the old, ugly blankets on the bed, not the pretty nice ones. And I said, what happened? Did you try it? He said, no, I didn't get around to it yet. And I was like, that's kind of interesting because I'm not really sure what you do here. So why didn't you have the time in a week to light the other ones on fire? So 3 times, again, it took me 3 times, kept coming back. Finally, he didn't do it. I said, all right, get in the car. We're going to go down to the warehouse, bring your matches. We're going to see if the ugly gray army blankets burn. And guess what? The ugly gray army blankets burned, right? So, and this guy wasn't one of the bad guys. I wasn't worried about this guy. This guy wasn't beating kids up. He was actually a pretty decent kid guy. The reason I tell this story is because it really sort of helps me and hopefully helps you understand what's going on here. At a certain point, you've worked in these facilities long enough and either perpetrated, witnessed, or purposely ignored enough bad stuff to these kids So the process of cognitive dissonance has had to set in for you to define these kids as unworthy of the pretty blanket. That's what was going on with this guy. If you went to this guy's house on a Sunday and watched a football game with them, if you went to church with him, he was coach of his kid's soccer team, this guy's a regular guy. Don't think of him, and don't think of those people in a Don Dale video as uniquely evil. If you do, you're never going to get on the other side of this issue. They are not uniquely evil. They are uniquely normal. They are just the rest of us with 20 years in a nightmarish system like this. Unlike the kids who come and go relatively quickly, who get damaged by this, these folks that you're seeing perpetrating this kind of damage have been damaged over years and years and years of participating and being indoctrinated to this kind of behavior. They didn't come in this way by and large. That's why these places have to close. If you go to the next slide, you can see this picture of Maya Angelou getting a plaque from one of the kids. Just look at Maya Angelou juxtaposed against that razor wire behind her. It's truly incredible. We gradually started to normalize the kids, also started to build on their assets. So this next slide is a picture of 5 of our young people giving testimony to a Harvard professor, Charles Ogletree, who was gathering information. This is shortly after President Obama was elected, gathering information from experts around the country on how to improve juvenile justice in America. And they invited me to speak, and I said, no, instead of me speaking, why don't we have some of our kids speak? And so they were the opening panel, actually, at this conference, and they were truly fantastic. Part of our approach to sort of improving outcomes for the kids was, like I said, building on their assets and letting them realize and giving them opportunities to show those assets off. So one thing we did was we built a ropes course inside the facility, which had to involve a tremendous number of skills. We did it jointly with Gallaudet University, which is in Washington, D.C., and is a school for deaf college students. So in order to be able to pull this off, the kids had to learn to sign and how to use pile drivers and construction equipment to build this ropes course. We played football. We always played football, by the way. That's one thing we were really good at because a lot of the guys were former football players. We always made it to the playoffs, and we would forfeit the playoffs because all of our games were inside the facility, and we were playing against D.C. public schools, and they wouldn't let the finals be played in a correctional facility that was going to be in the community. So we would make it to the finals and forfeit. The year I was there, we went to the finals. We just authorized a ton of overtime. Staff guarded the facility. None of the kids did anything wrong, and we won. We were city champs that year. It was really terrific. This is a photo of the mayor. That's the mayor right in the middle there. You can see me with my head popped up way in the back. And this was a performance at the Folger Shakespeare Library. Our kids participated in the competition that the Folger does every year and won. We were the best ensemble, and Our Lady Macbeth won Best Actor. All that having been said, all those improvements, you can see our maintenance guy locking Oak Hill, which was the facility, which continues to be the proudest day of my professional career. So while all that was happening, we were designing and building a new facility, and we really wanted this to be a new beginning, and that's what we named the facility, New Beginnings. And we wanted it to be dramatically different, only to be as secure enough as it was required to keep kids in secure custody, but to try to have design elements that would normalize and naturalize the environment for the kids as much as we possibly could. So if you take a look at this sort of landscape that of the new facility, you can see it's wildly different than what was in the previous facility. Looks more like a college campus. This is a picture of the day room, lots of light, comfortable furniture that a normal person would sit in, not correctional furniture, all carpeted. By the way, that soft furniture and the carpeting means an awful lot in these correctional facilities because it really reduces the din one of the things that it's hard to describe how loud these places are, and I think that sort of creates tension and trauma for everybody, again, for the kids and for the staff who have to work in it. This is a photo of my chief of staff giving some people a tour of one of the kids' rooms. A couple of design elements I'd just like to point out. The window that has that star on. First of all, the kids could put stuff up on the walls. They weren't allowed to put stuff up on the walls in the previous place. If you look at that window that has a star on it, that window is openable by the kids. You rarely are able to open your own window in a correctional facility. Just returns a little power and control back to the kids. That wall on the right side of the photo is painted with blackboard paint. It's chalkboard paint. Turns the wall essentially into a chalkboard. And then we just gave the kids buckets of chalk. And you can see this kid was actually a pretty good artist. And there's Maya Angelou down at the bottom there. So her appearance there was obviously pretty impressive to him. We had graffiti issues in the previous facility. I'm sure Don Dale must, everyone does. Once we put those blackboard walls up and gave the kids chalk and said, knock yourselves out, do whatever you want on that wall, we had no more graffiti problems. The other design feature, it's hard, you can't really see it because it's the door that you're not seeing. We had issues, as I said earlier, with the kids urinating and defecating in their cells. It was always difficult to know whether the guards were doing that to humiliate the kids or whether they just couldn't get to the door by the time the kid needed to go to the bathroom. So when we built this, we put a button in the rooms so that you could get out of your own cell. So the door would close at night, the doors would all lock. If you needed to go to the bathroom at night, you would hit the button, a little light would go on outside, and a small ding so that staff would know you were coming out so you didn't surprise them. All the other buttons for all the other kids in the room would be disabled so that 10 kids couldn't rush out on staff all at one time at night. Kid would go out and do his business, he'd return, close the door, and then that would enable the other buttons in case any other kids had to go to the bathroom. We told the staff, guess what's going to happen when this first opens up? All the kids are going to push the buttons. It's what you would do if you were locked into a room. Just take a breath. Don't overreact. They'll stop pushing the buttons. They're 16 years old. They shouldn't really have to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. And they'll stop going to the bathroom in the middle of the night once it doesn't get a rise out of you anymore. This next shot is a photo of one of our young people in our metallurgy class. It was an interesting project. We got the police to donate a bunch of guns to us that they seized in crimes or that they bought back in these gun buyback programs. And then we hooked up with the Blacksmiths Association of the Middle Atlantic States, who even knew such a thing existed. And they took all these guns and they turned them into artwork, and they called it the Guns to Roses program. And then they interacted with victims groups who had lost loved ones. Many of the kids themselves had been shot or had lost loved ones themselves. So those were really interesting, and I thought uplifting meetings between the victims and the kids. And this metallurgy work, creating artwork out of these guns, was a really meaningful way for the kids to be able to sort of express themselves, and particularly traumatized young people have a hard time expressing themselves. This is our fantastic gym. Once we had this and it had these great stands, we started having basketball competitions. We competed against other schools, but also the city council, who was now so interested in this, because now there was a reform, so people started to pay attention as the story started to change about a department that was doing nothing but bad stuff to a department that actually was doing some good stuff. City council organized a series of basketball games during which council members and their staff played against the kids. They were only going to have one game. They ended up having 9 games. Several of them went to overtime, and we won 5-4. Not that I'm really that into winning, but it was kind of nice to win to 5-4. This next one is a 125-seat auditorium that we had. There were only 60 kids in the facility, but we wanted them to put on music, have plays, graduations. We wanted their families to come, so we would rent buses to bring their families up to the facility so that they could, see their kids perform just like any of you would want to see your own kids perform. This is the outside of the theater, the back of the theater. We got some money up for a mural. The kids selected the muralist. They talked through what they wanted with him, and then when the time came to install it, the young people were involved at every stage of the installation process. And this is just a farewell shot. Okay, so I want to just talk about what the conclusions of our report were. We had four essential, 4 R's, we called them, the 4 R's of closing youth prisons: reduce the pipeline into youth prisons, reform the culture that wrongly assumes locking kids up makes us safer, replace youth prisons with small, home-like, decent facilities close to young people's homes, and then reinvest the savings into a range of community services that can support kids in the community. In the paper, which you'll see a link to at the end of the presentation, we give several examples from California, Missouri, New York City, Ohio, Texas, Virginia, and Washington, where states have done stuff like this. I'm just going to take you through one, the Texas example, just because it's so unusual. People think of Texas as being so tough on crime, and indeed Texas was. 2007, there was horrible sex scandal in Texas's youth commissions. There was ritualized sexual abuse of kids up to and including the wardens of the facilities, and it was all orchestrated with the wardens and the correctional officers in the facilities. It was truly outrageous. The Texas legislature was shocked, rightfully, and acted forcefully. They banned low-level kids from coming into the facility, so nobody could get placed in the Texas Youth Commission for misdemeanor offenses. They limited stays to your 19th birthday, at which point you were released. It used to be 21. They closed 8 facilities out of 11, saving $150 million a year. They took $57 million of those savings and sent it back to the counties so the counties could buy services and programs for the young people. So one could rightly ask, what were the results of this? Was this a jailbreak? Did kids all of a sudden start running the streets of Texas? Was it, the answer to both of those were decidedly no. You can see there's a 38% decline in the number of youth incarcerated in Texas. That was accompanied by a 49% decline in youth arrests. By comparison, during that same time in Texas, there was only a 2% decline in adult incarceration and a much more tepid 8% decline in adult arrests. So put another way, incarceration in Texas for juveniles declined at 19 times the rate of which incarceration did for adults, driven by policies enacted by the legislature and signed into law by the governor, but youth arrests declined 5 times as much as adult arrests did anyway. So the question you have to ask yourself in the Northern Territory and Australia is, can you replicate some of the changes that have gone on in the U.S.? Can you eliminate this youth prison model, allocate the money that you save to a network of community programs for your young people, and then just have small and decent facilities that provide rehabilitation for your youth in an environment that any of you would feel okay about putting your own child? I think that needs to be the standard by which you judge whatever reforms you enact. Thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate, again, the invitation.